Interpol officer Tony Applegate, like all of us, has heard that aliens probably exist and certainly want to take over the Earth. Do they want to? A small correction. They've already captured her. Why was it captured? It's a strange question. They wanted to eat, so they captured it. And now they're among us. Tony Applegate knows this, and his life will never be the same again.
Between a cat who shits in his slippers and a boss who shits in his personal file, you should choose a cat. However, Tony Applegate was not yet ready to give up his job at Interpol, even in order to replace the chief with a cat. However, today, the potential cat was closer than ever to the transition to a kinetic state. And to think, Tony said almost hatefully, that I've been dreaming about this since I was a kid. That's right, he dreamed of becoming a policeman from about the age of 6. He was sure that he would definitely succeed. He even had police eyes, steel gray, the most appropriate look for a cop. You can't think of a better way to throw lightning bolts when you're being blasted by your superiors for nothing. Well, don't exaggerate, Grant chuckled. A beating from the boss was hardly part of your childhood dreams. If anyone couldn't boast of the right eyes for a cop, it was Grant. His eyes were absolutely civilian, peaceful, brown, reminiscent of the shade of Manchurian walnut. 20 years ago, Tony would have decided that their soft, warm gaze simply could not belong to a world where the night spits out fire and lead, and handcuffs snap on the hands of villains. But Grant's last name was Lestrade, the most famous policeman. Did they include such a disgrace? Tony almost howled. We're just the local cops' favorite clowns now. Show of the year. An elderly lady passing by with a huge fluffy cat on a chain smiled encouragingly at an obviously upset young man. Tony gave her a sad smile, sighed, and leaned back on the bench. 6 warrants, Grant. 6. And every last dummy. And Alderboy is making fun of us. It's scary to even think about it. Would you cry if you were in his place? Grant snorted. I'd be laughing my ass off, Tony replied gloomily. Kevin Alderboy was a byword, a pain in the ass, and a thorn in the side of Interpol, and he had every right to be amused. A search of his apartment had failed 6 times in a row. An accurate tip, Tony said bitterly. Correct information. Kevin Alderboy is buying stolen art all over the world. It's a small matter to take this bastard by the scruff of the neck. 6 attempts, and we, along with the local police, are left with a collar in our hands, and he leaves clean, as soon as he hasn't sued us yet. 6 searches, with a dog, with a metal detector, with a Geiger counter, with an X-ray. Maybe we should invite psychics to the next one? We have nothing left to lose. We won't look any more stupid. Where there is nothing, nothing will be found. Well, why on earth would the boss get it into his head that he keeps stolen goods at home? Our boss is a romantic, Grant grinned. Old school, what do you want? How does he think? Alderboy must have some kind of secret hiding place where he keeps all these masterpieces and admires them. And not through security cameras, but in person. In the flesh, so to speak. Which means he has to visit this secret bunker all the time. He was surrounded tightly. Surveillance was put on conscience, where and when he happens. It is known to the smallest detail, literally every minute. And no deviations from the schedule were noticed. And if he doesn't go anywhere, it means he keeps stolen goods with him. It just can't be otherwise. That's the kind of romance. I'd tell you what I think of her, Tony said, but I can't. Then I'll have to arrest myself for violating public morals. Grant laughed. Well, I've already figured out what you think about romance, he replied. What do you think about the case? That's bullshit. Tony waved his hand. Alderboy won't admire the masterpieces. He doesn't need to. He's about as good at art as I am at aliens. I think even less. Grant smiled. I won't argue. Tony nodded. The main thing is that he knows absolutely nothing about art. For him, it's just a good investment. I agree, Grant replied. What's the point of admiring a checkbook? Nothing to admire, Tony replied. but it makes sense to keep an eye on. He definitely doesn't have anything at home, but somewhere within reach, somewhere close. Within the limits of normal movement, Grant said slowly. Tony considered this idea for several long seconds, like a meeting with his superiors. That's right, he nodded. That's right, Grant. It's even strange that no one has thought of it yet. Well, are we going back to the department? To the department? Grant was surprised. What's wrong with working in Hyde Park? The sky is blue, the sun is yellow, birds are singing, butterflies are flying, dogs are walking, girls are smiling, and no one cares about us at all. Ideal working conditions. And the materials on the case? I have a netbook with me. Wait, so are you carrying official information with you? Tony realized. Of course, Grant replied calmly, uncovering his netbook. A cop partner is a creative profession, like a poet or a composer. In general, in the 24/7 mode. I just can't leave my brains in my desk drawer until morning. Well, inspiration hit me like an apple hit Newton, or you just needed an urgent certificate. What am I supposed to do, rush to the department at 3 in the morning? Not really. The boss will find out. He'll blow his head off, Tony breathed, admiring his partner's arbitrariness. Let him get his own first, and then he'll try to kill someone else's, Grant chuckled. Until then, he won't find anything in my car. And he's not the only one. I'm not the worst programmer in our department. In Tony's opinion, Grant was not just not the worst, but actually the best programmer in their department, and possibly the entire London branch. And the action unfolding in front of him on the netbook screen proved this truth as well as possible. Let ordinary users wait with bated breath for new games with incredible graphics. Programmers don't condescend to such banality. They have other entertainment options. There is nothing sweeter than to unearth some old, downright primitive toy, such that even a standard emulator does not take it, adapt it to modern technology, screw an unimaginably cool mod on it, and slip it to fellow human beings. This is exactly the kind of game that showed up on Grant's netbook. The third, Police Quest. Tony raced this game when he was 7 years old, and even then, it was considered as ancient as the remains of a dinosaur. She looked like a resurrected dinosaur now. Wait a bit, Grant said. I've set the save ahead of time here. On the screen, Mike Downs explained that he was a busy man and advised him to insert the access card so that the arrow was on top. For a moment, Tony was like a kid again, waiting impatiently for this nerd to shut up, and he and Sonny would move on. Sonny Bonds, please call the dispatcher back immediately. Sonny, you need to get to Aspen Falls on a call right away. Everyone else is busy.
You can take a cop off the street, but you can't take a street off a cop, right, Sonny? Okay, I've been sitting too long in this stuffy place. It's time for some fresh air.
And Tony remembered that after that, Sonny had to get up from the table and go out into the hallway. But then Grant touched the touchpad, pointed the cursor at the computer on Sonny's desk, and quickly clicked on it. Why? Because it's just part of the background. Click at least until the day after tomorrow. The game won't respond. The game responded. She indignantly declared, "BIIP."
I will ask without obscene expressions, Grant purred.
The game once again expressed its indignation and disappeared from the screen. A text file took its place. The order has been submitted. 1. Grant smiled. Clever. Tony appreciated. In this manner you can search for hidden things for a long time, and you don't say what you will find. Looking for it? Grant asked softly. Well, no. If anyone searches for anything in my car, that is, performs any actions other than those provided in advance, the information will simply self-destruct. Only the game will remain. You're a maniac, Tony gasped happily. Exactly. The computer Hannibal Lecter. An extraneous paw extended to my netbook has performed an unacceptable operation and will be bitten off. Then I'd rather not hold out, Tony chuckled. Show me what we have on this joker. Grant's fingers slid over the keys. Kevin Alderboy's routine, which had been repeatedly studied inside and out, meekly revealed itself for a new test. Business lunches, not suitable.
Are you sure?
Completely. Different times, different places, different people. Mostly the ones Alderboy doesn't trust. Moreover, the place and time were not always chosen by him, and the opportunity to leave the table unnoticed for at least 10 minutes is 0. No, it's an empty number. Visiting theaters and exhibitions? Different. A businessman is supposed to look cultured. Except to look like it. Judging by the list of visits, he doesn't know anything about art. It doesn't matter what he knows. The main thing is that these outings are also a dummy. He goes there to be seen. I turned around at the opening of the exhibition, smiled at the journalists. They say, here I am, a modern businessman. But I'm not a stranger, you know. I'm not a stranger. New trends in art. In general, the usual set of stupidities. And then where will he go? Besides, video cameras are everywhere. A dummy? Definitely. I'd rather take a closer look at the exhibitions he sponsored. It doesn't matter. See for yourself. Different places. And not all of them, even in London. Well, this aesthete hamster doesn't carry his treasures in cheek pouches. He doesn't. Let's look further. So, once every 3 months, a preventive checkup with a doctor, once every 2 months with a dentist, and he loves himself, it turns out. He does, yes. Cherishes and cherishes, but it doesn't give us anything. Why? Because of the visitors? No, they're just more of a veil than a hindrance. But for Kevin Alderboy to wait 2 months until he can check his pot. You're right. He won't wait that long. The wrong person. It's a pity. Everything turned out so well. The press would be all over the headlines. Secret hiding of stolen masterpieces under the protection of a maniac dentist. With a drill at the ready. My God, what kind of trash are you watching in the movies?
Actually, on TV. Is there a difference?
Yes, actually there is no difference. What's next for us? And then we have the Taliesin Peak Gym 3 times a week. Tony burst out laughing, choked on his laughter and coughed. The top of what? He managed to catch his breath. No, really? Absolutely. I'm ready to lay my head off. Alderboy fell for the name, Tony said, still a little hoarsely. It's just like him. I wonder who the owner is. His brother in mind, so to speak. Lestrade's fingers moved quickly over the keys once more, then slowed down, and then stopped altogether, finally stroking the air above the keyboard. Well, that's interesting, Grant said absently. Surprises? Tony asked. And some more. Grant grinned. Look for yourself. The building is old. It was almost demolished a couple of times, but the Societies for the Protection of Everything and Everything intervened, so the house was not demolished, but only rebuilt from the inside. Although not so much. There was a gym there before the Second World War, and during the war, there was an air raid shelter in the basement. A good basement, right? Both durable and roomy. After the war, well, it doesn't really matter how many times this house has changed hands. The main thing is who owns it now. And guess who bought it? Evie. That's the one. Mr. Joe Avey. If Kevin Alderboy was a log in the eye of Interpol, then Joe Avey could rightfully be called a branch that could not be cut down from the notorious log. Evie. This is the voice of a child pronouncing the name of his favorite ice cream. The best-running crocodile in Alderboy's team, and a building with a substantial basement, and the gym is definitely for their own. Alderboy goes there 3 times a week and we don't even know. And most likely he is the real owner, and Avey is just a distraction. Now it looks so obvious. Well, is that how we could have screwed it all up? It's been too long looking for a black cat in a dark room, Grant replied. Meanwhile, a white dog stole sausages in broad daylight, and she ate it. Things happen. Perhaps it's for the best in some ways. The dog got impudent and stopped being careful. It's time to catch her. What followed was pure adventure. Because according to all the rules, as many as there are, the capture of arrogant white dogs is carried out by the local police department, not Interpol. The operation must be a joint one. But the boss balked. If he has made a decision, certainly with a capital letter, no one has yet succeeded in moving him from his chosen position. But this time, I didn't really want to. No, it's not that. Having been defeated 6 times, it's a shame to give the newly found key to victory into the wrong hands. The boss wasn't that petty. He just believed that the best way to ruin any idea was to delegate its execution. Secondly, the boss was well aware that, for all its persuasiveness, the new idea could also be a failure. For the 7th time in a row, it would be better to sit in a puddle without witnesses. And thirdly, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean you're not being followed. If the boss wasn't paranoid, at least he was eager to be. What does it mean that the local police are always ready to cooperate? Who said so? Is that what she said? Did she say that there was probably someone in her valiant ranks who was involved in crime? No. But there is someone. There is. Tame. Baited. There was no way Alderboy would have behaved so brazenly if he hadn't had his own mole in the local police. And now, when the hope of pinning Alderboy finally dawned, there was no question of sharing information with the local police in advance.
In a word, whoever cooks his honey drinks it himself. And since the honey was brewed by 2 Interpol officers, outsiders won't get a drop. Therefore, a few days later, 2 tax inspectors showed up at Mr. Avy's establishment with an unscheduled inspection.
Tony and Grant turned out to be tax officials, better than the real ones. It turned out to be impossible to purchase a subscription to the Peaks of Taliesin gym. As Tony had expected, they were puffing under a barbell and suffocating on a treadmill, pumping muscles and losing weight, exclusively their own. In addition, there was no exit from the hall to the stairs leading to the basement. These problems did not exist for the 2 tax inspectors. Of course, there were some interruptions. Of course, Mr. Avy, hissing like spit on a hot iron, called the tax department to find out what the hell. Of course, Mr. Avy was vaguely told that he had a signal. Of course, Mr. Avy has expressed everything he thinks about dirty snitches and those who listen to them. His stock of thoughts on this subject, interspersed with quite harmless pronouns, lasted for about 4 minutes, and only then the new arrivals were able to start the audit. If Joe Avy had been cheating on taxes, the inspectors would have been watching. But Vershka's reporting was in full swing, and therefore, after the first outburst of indignation, he gave up on them. If the guys want to look for sleeves from the vest, let them look. They get paid for it. Does it make sense to pay attention to something that you don't see as a threat? Less than 2 hours later, the presence of the inspectors was not exactly forgotten, but they stopped really noticing it, and no one noticed at all when the office workers went one by one to lunch that 2 of the tax officers had safely managed to get lost. Of course, losing 2 tax inspectors at once is a special achievement in its own way. You could say it's a record, but not if the lost ones have mastered the art of being somewhere here. There is nothing mystical about it. It is successfully used by the husbands of quarrelsome wives, movie stars fleeing from the paparazzi, and precisely those officials who must put an urgent seal on our documents. These people don't walk through walls, fall into an underground passage, or teleport to Antarctica. No, they're all here somewhere. Tony and Grant knew the art of being somewhere here well. None of Mr. Avy's employees sounded the alarm. Even when the operation was completed, they were ready to swear that the 2 from the tax office were here somewhere. However, it was still a long way from the completion of the operation. The stairs are over there, Grant said, shaking his head.
How are we going to get through? There are cameras everywhere.
Video cameras on turntables leisurely strolled around the territory entrusted to their care with an indifferent glass gaze. I'll guide you through the blind spots, Grant promised confidently. Are you sure? Tony's eyes narrowed in disbelief.
Approximately,
Grant grinned. The option to turn around and leave was not even considered. The option of leaving to re-enter next time was a completely pointless waste of time, not to mention an unnecessary risk. There was really only one thing to do: follow Grant closely and hope that his instincts would not deceive him. Grant walked calmly, almost without stopping. They had already climbed 2 flights of stairs. There was only one last flight with a closet facing it, one of those where spare mops are usually kept, and one more flight. And then Grant suddenly stopped and turned around. His face became tense, like that of a man who got soap in his eyes while washing. "What is it?" Tony asked very softly, almost with his lips. Even that barely audible whisper made Grant wince in annoyance. He put his fingers to his lips. "Be silent. Not a sound." And then he froze, listening. Tony hadn't heard anything yet, but he was sure Grant hadn't imagined it. Grant jerked his head toward the cubicle. Her door was wide open. They couldn't know what was in the closet, but there was nowhere else to hide.
There was nowhere to hide in the closet either.
There was nothing in it except a swivel chair and a small stand with obscure sensors and switches. And the footsteps now heard not only by Grant, but also by Tony, were inexorably approaching. Who is this? Where is he going? To the basement or to this tiny room? But even if he goes to the basement, it's too late to close the door. He'll probably notice. And is it being closed at all? It doesn't seem to be. What if this person is heading here? Tony didn't have time to think this thought through to its logical conclusion. Grant tugged at his sleeve, pointed at the door with his gaze, and exhaled almost soundlessly. "This way." An old children's idea. If the door opens inside, it's so fun to hide between the open door and the wall. But there's not enough room behind the door for two people, especially adults, just for one thing. Grant pushed Tony toward the door. He looked back at his partner, confused and helpless. Did Grant really want Tony to hide alone? The footsteps on the stairs sounded very close. Grant suddenly pushed Tony, and Tony didn't understand how he got behind the door or where Lestrade had gone. And Grant seemed to have disappeared through the ground. Only a few moments later, someone entered the room. Tony couldn't see him, but he could hear the chair creak slightly under his weight, and the switches clicked. He could hear a lot, the slightly heavy breathing of an elderly man, and muttering, and the repeated creaking of a chair. But Tony couldn't hear a single sound coming from Grant. Yes, but the guy who's cheerfully flipping switches right now also clearly doesn't see or hear anyone next to him. He acts like there's no Grant Lestrade around at all. Damn, that's all. Tony had no time for riddles. His whole being was focused on not giving himself away, let alone by a rustle, by breathing. He did not think and could not think where Grant was hiding. It was enough for him that Grant had managed to hide. It was only when the chair creaked with a slight squeak for the last time, and a little later the sound of retreating footsteps was already heard from the stairs, that Tony exhaled very softly, and finally looked out from behind the door. He just froze. There was no sign of Grant in the room, but there was something else. Only now did Tony discover to his amazement that his hand was clutching the paw of a teddy bear that had appeared from nowhere. A very, very familiar teddy bear. One day, Tony's cousin, buying a toy car for her 3-year-old son, asked the seller to give her a car designed to get directly into the hands of a child. One that will last at least a couple of months. This is not to say that she was wrong, however, not all children break toys. Donek took care of his teddy bear more than his eyes. There would be nowhere else to take it. What kind of toys are there? It would be enough to pay for housing and feed yourself. However, since Adam joined Taylor Schneider as an apprentice, there was more than one pair of hands in the family, and Donek no longer went to bed hungry. And then Taylor Schneider allowed Addis to take the scraps for himself, and Addis sewed a bear cub for his brother. The father polished 2 tiny pieces of Manchurian walnut, and the bear had eyes. Donek spent every free minute with his plush treasure. And after the elder brother was taken to the war, he did not part with him at all. Adam's close-cropped head looked unusually lop-eared. His overcoat was too big for him, and his skinny neck stuck out of the collar like a pencil out of a glass. Undoubtedly, to an outsider, Adam was a hilarious sight, but Donek wasn't laughing, and the little bear wasn't laughing. They waited for Adam together. On sleepless nights, Donek would whisper fervently into his plush ear, "Adam will be back, you'll see. He will definitely come back. I'm telling you exactly." The little bear did not argue. He was silent in agreement, pressing against the boy's cheek. Addis really returned, and even found a family among other refugees who had been torn away by the war. The little bear saw how a lame soldier in a tattered overcoat who was too tall suddenly walked quickly, dragging his leg, towards Donek, and then bent down and picked up the boy in his arms. He's seen a lot of things in his life, this little bear. 2 world wars and 1 civil war, not to mention the revolution. Ghetto and escape from it. The road to France and the crossing of the Pyrenees. A crowded hold and alien slums. The past years have made him a polyglot. Jewish, Polish, and Russian speech was replaced in his environment by German, French, and then Spanish, and only in the 43rd year of the 20th century did the people next to him speak English. It was a little worn when it got into Tony's hands, but it didn't matter. Or not. It did matter. He was no match for new toys straight out of the store, funny and silly. The teddy bear of Daniel's great-grandfather, Agnes's grandmother, Uncle Jacob, and then his mother's. He was older than Tony, smarter and more experienced. He knew life much better. Tony had never played any girly games with him. That's another thing. He was Tony's partner, because Tony was always a cop. From the age of 6, Tony didn't think of himself as anything else, ever since the day his girlfriend Leslie was almost abducted. When a gangly guy grabbed Leslie by the arm and dragged her into the car, the girl was so scared that she couldn't even scream. And Tony wasn't scared at all. Well, except later, when it was all over. Then he grabbed Leslie's other arm and pulled so hard that she had to have her dislocation fixed. It's not difficult to take one child away. It's much more difficult to handle 2, especially if the second one is pushing like a little hippo. And Tony was pushing with all his might, kicking, never letting go of Leslie for a moment, and screaming, without taking a breath. He was calling for help so that his ears hurt. Luckily, there was a cop nearby, although Tony was pretty sure that luck, or at least luck, had absolutely nothing to do with it. There had to be a cop. This is a law of nature. It later turned out that the lanky guy was a terrible maniac whom they had been looking for 6 months, and Tony and Leslie were basking in the rays of well-deserved fame. However, Tony did not consider his frenzied screams to be some kind of feat, and his sudden fame to be something serious. Just think, it's a big deal. They printed it in the newspapers. More importantly, that policeman called Tony brave and resourceful. From that moment on, Tony Applegate's fate was sealed. He's going to be a cop, and he's going to be a cop too. In his childhood games, Tony was always exclusively a policeman, and never a private investigator. He wasn't attracted to Mike Hammer, Hercule Poirot, or even Sherlock Holmes. Tony was even a little offended by Holmes. Who's arguing Sherlock Holmes is a genius, and in general he's the best? But that's no reason to bully Inspector Lestrade like that, right? The inspector is a good cop, conscientious and brave. He does his duty honestly. And the best book about Holmes is The Hound of the Baskervilles, my favorite, because it was the inspector who saved Sir Henry with his well-aimed shot. But Tony still thought that the inspector had not been treated fairly. And he named his teddy partner Lestrade. Grant Lestrade. How could he have forgotten? Tony's hand involuntarily opened, but the toy did not plop to the floor. What slipped out of his suddenly weak fingers was not the bear's paw, but the palm of Interpol officer Lestrade, and he stood firmly on his feet. "Who are you?" Tony asked in a hoarse, ragged whisper, as the footsteps finally died away in the distance.
"There's no such word in your language," Grant replied after a pause.
"Which one is there?" Tony said a little more firmly. It's a stupid question, of course. However, Tony would later like to see someone who could ask a smarter question.
"The Japanese call people like us tsukumogami," Grant said. "Kicking someone?" Tony did not understand.
Grant chuckled softly.
"Tsukumogami," he repeated patiently. "I agree. It doesn't sound like much, but it's still better than an alien intelligent being, right?"
Tony reached out and touched Grant's shoulder with his fingertips. The real one, no doubt about it. Not ghostly, and not even a teddy bear. "So you're this alien?" Tony asked, looking lost.
"This one?"
Grant nodded. A real detective always keeps his composure. At least that's what they said in the books they loved since childhood. It didn't say that a good detective retains the ability to think even when his composure is completely lost. The last thing Tony could boast of right now was mental balance. But the tenacious mind of the policeman grasped Grant's words. "They call people like us," and did not allow them to escape from the scene of the crime. And there are many of you like that? Tony said tonelessly.
A lot. Grant nodded.
That is, you have us. A direct and clear logical conclusion did not want to be pronounced. It was stuck not even in the mouth, but in the throat, but it must be expressed, regardless of any desires. Have you captured us? You could say that.
Why? Tony asked in a clear, childish whisper. Why didn't you stay at home? As always, Grant shrugged. Why are they conquering at all? I wanted to live. I was hungry.
And who do you eat? Tony asked with painful calmness. His friend and partner Grant Lestrade turned out to be his own teddy bear. His baby bear turned out to be an alien. The invader. No, Tony wasn't afraid that the stuffed monster would eat him. He wasn't scared at all. He was disgusted. Betrayal is a vile thing. And the most heinous thing of all is the betrayal of a childhood friend, someone you believe wholeheartedly. It's not even you who believe, but the child you once were. Not who, Grant corrected pedantically, but what. We eat delight, devotion, love, joy. Everything that is experienced at the sight of something beautiful, cordially dear, close. We starve to death if we are not fed these feelings. Tony was very fond of the bear. What's true is true. Dear and close. Tony whispered all sorts of childhood secrets to him. He was the first to know that Tony would definitely become a cop. And the cop that Tony had become was feeling an incomparable sense of relief right now. It's one thing to think that a traitor will eat you. It's quite another thing to know that your childhood affection saved your friend from starvation. Aren't your feelings enough for you? He muttered clumsily. Do we need ours?
Do you know the word cannibalism? Grant asked. Tony stopped.
Almost all intelligent beings go through a stage of cannibalism in one way or another, Grant continued, and they try to forget her as soon as possible.
Tony nodded. That was understandable.
We've had a long childhood, Tony, Grant said after another pause. By your standards, it's a very long time, about 100 years old, and we have been defenseless for these 100 years. As adults, we are no different from those who fed us with their feelings. You can x-ray me, examine my blood under a microscope. I'm the same person as you, now, although I can take on the same appearance for a while, if necessary.
What if I were a green octopus? Tony asked.
I'd be a green octopus too, Grant grinned. And I could have had fish for lunch, or whatever octopuses eat. But these 100 years of childhood, we are not like you. This shape, call it ghostly, energetic, or some kind of molecular structure, everything will be true, and everything will be inaccurate. You just don't know such a form of life, and I won't be able to explain to you what we are at this time. We are Tsukumogami.
What is this thing? Tony pleaded. Tsukumogami is an object that has become a human being. At least that's how the Japanese understand it.
A werewolf umbrella? Tony was stunned.
At least, Grant nodded.
But then, Tony's mind was completely in chaos. It turns out that he was bitten by another umbrella? Or a closet? Grant laughed softly but heartily. Tony, what the hell are you talking about? How can an umbrella bite? And how can you bite a closet so that it bites an umbrella later? How do you imagine that? Where did you get this?
To the movies, Tony muttered, feeling stupid.
Even if it's on Wikipedia, Grant waved his hand. Werewolf, if you want to know, is not transmitted by biting at all, especially among cabinets and umbrellas. But an umbrella can become a Tsukumogami if one of us chooses to merge it. This is our children's uniform. We merge into the subject. Beautiful, made by the hand of a craftsman, the one that will be admired, or use it for a long time, passing from generation to generation. If it survives for 100 years, its inhabitant will become human. And if it doesn't? Tony was afraid to hear the answer because he had anticipated it. Grant sighed. Sometimes you manage to survive and find another object, he said reluctantly. But then the adult form will be a sick person, maybe a cripple, and more often than not, even this fails. The same applies if the item is irreparably damaged. The Japanese made a good point here too. Well, that's almost right. Minor scratches and stuff don't count, but serious damage will maim or kill us. And you risked becoming a toy, Tony said slowly, as if he couldn't believe himself. A favorite toy, Grant corrected him. Your great-grandfather Daniel did not part with his bear. He doted on him. He kept me safe, and I kept him safe. We can't protect ourselves. We get lost, thrown away, broken. But we can protect those who love us. To survive the pogroms, Tony said slowly. Escape from the ghetto, to cross so many borders. That's right, Grant nodded. That's our nature. We protect you as a child and give you what you need as adults. And what did I need? Tony asked quietly, anticipating the answer again. Only this time he wanted to hear it. A friend, Grant replied. My partner, Grant Lestrade. No, Grant is definitely a teddy bear and an alien. A person would be embarrassed to say such infinitely natural words, but he would at least care. You know, you don't look like a teddy bear at all, Tony muttered awkwardly, carefully not looking at Lestrade. Am I supposed to be small, fat, and plush? Grant asked, amused. You're wrong. Our adult form does not depend on who we would have been in childhood. I'll definitely introduce you to one of my friends. A hefty forehead under 2 meters tall, muscles. The Hulk will get jealous. As a child, it was a family wedding ring. Can you imagine? Tony had no idea. And the actress Linda Owen used to be a grain barn in South Wales. Tony just shook his head. Linda Owen, a petite, graceful girl, looked the least like a barn. Speaking of barns, attics, and other basements, Grant reminded him. That's true, Tony agreed. It's time to say goodbye to this mysterious equipment before someone else catches us here. Actually, it's not a mysterious piece of equipment, Grant snorted, but an indirect proof. What do you mean? Tony was surprised. This is the control panel for the climate control system. Think about it yourself, why a special microclimate is needed in the basement, and why it cannot be controlled from a common control room. Of course, it was possible to come up with many of the most intricate explanations. But let the lawyers handle it, and the police need only one explanation. The right one. Tony was completely stunned by the basement.
It looked not just old, but antique. Even the ancient ones.
Who built these walls of tightly fitted stones and when? And was this room a basement in those early days? Or did it become one when the paving level rose inexorably and the house sank into the ground, as is usually the case with old buildings? Probably there was a basement here even then. There is no hint of windows in the stone walls, no later masonry in place of the former openings, only heavy stone and stained oak, black from time to time. Incredible power. Next to her, the armored wall with the steel door seemed inappropriately fragile and almost flirtatious. Tony knew that such doors were usually a good half-meter thick, but the achievement of modern technology still looked fleeting and momentary, losing to the ancient masonry with a crushing score. Tony stared at the ancient wall, mesmerized, and even touched the rough stone with his fingertips. It's crazy. Grant, look at that, he gasped enthusiastically. Absolutely, Grant replied, carefully examining the combination lock on the door. Oh, I'm sorry, Tony said, embarrassed. Again, I'm not at the right time. Well, of course, Grant objected. It's always about time to feed the hungry. Hungry? Feed them? Once upon a time, athletes celebrated their victories in this basement. Music, dancing, laughing girls, a lot of noise and fun. Once upon a time, residents of the city of London hid in this basement during the bombing. Once. And then Alderboy bought the building, rebuilt it, put Joe Avey in the director's chair, and locked the basement. And little Tsukumogami was left alone. No one else was feeding him joy and hope. No one was laughing in these walls. No one was dancing. It was creepy to think that all this heavy bulk was just a shelter for an abandoned child. The child was lonely and hungry, but he couldn't leave the trapped stone body. Well, except to reach up at least a little, up to where people are, at least to look at them through the stupid eyes of video cameras.
Video cameras? Yeah.
So that's how Grant got them both through their blind spots. More precisely, that's who really did it. That's who turned the cameras away from the walking cops. And he warned Grant that someone was coming into the control room, warned him before Grant could hear footsteps. Tony gave a strangled sigh. The damn lump stuck in my throat and wouldn't swallow at all.
Thank you, Tally, he said hoarsely, putting his palm against the stone wall.
And with a warm wave in his heart, he felt a sudden response, strong and undeniable, just like the one that came from the smile of a teddy bear in the old days, when 6-year-old Tony knew for sure that his teddy inspector was alive.
Tally,
Grant repeated slowly, as if tasting the sounds, and smiled. That's a good name. I think your godson will be happy to put it in his passport in due course.
A passport? Where does an alien get a passport from anyway?
So stop. Is that really what you should be thinking about right now?
And you're right. Tally was looking out for us. We wouldn't have been able to get here without him, much less open the lock.
Such a clever device? It's a classic device, Grant explained. I saw this. We had a briefing when I was still working in another department. Look, there are numbers from 0 to 99 on the dial, only 100. There are special discs with slots in the lock core. There are 4 of them. That means there are 100 possible combinations to the 4th power. You mean 100 million? Tony whistled. Exactly. You know, it's impossible to manually select the right combination. This piece of hardware will rust sooner than we open it in this manner, but we won't have to pick it up. Tally had seen her so many times. Grant didn't finish the sentence, and Tony didn't ask him again. He stared with all his eyes as Grant turned the dial, following instructions inaudible to him, but intelligible to Tsukumogami. 5 times to the right to 96, Grant repeated aloud for Tally, and his thin, flexible fingers confidently followed the instructions. 4 times left to 15. 3 times to the right until 8. Double left to 49. And what's next? Tony couldn't stand it.
And then we'll open it, Grant replied.
He pressed the handle to the right of the lock. There is, he announced cheerfully. Get it. He took hold of the huge round plaque on the door and pulled it with Tony's help. The door opened heavily, reluctantly, and suddenly gave way, as if a third person had joined the efforts of the 2 policemen. Thank you, Tally. This time it was Grant who said the words. Yes, you're right. It would be better to block it, in order not to close it at all. He turned to Tony. Well, Aladdin, let's see what's in the cave. Since Sesame has opened, why not? Tony replied in the same tone. Well, there was a lot to see in the cave. And Tony was completely unprepared for this sight. The Little Dutch. The Delacroix study. Dali's drawings are striking with the confident precision of each stroke. A Chinese vase made of white jade. The incredible, amazing purity of its lines was as light as the breathing of a sleeping child. An invaluable Japanese screen with paintings based on scenes from Genji Monogatari. Antique cameos, perfect clarity of carving, sometimes layered. A silver service made by Cellini. A Sumerian jasper amulet, the pensive Degas ballerina. Stolen from an exhibition in Sweden, Regina in White, is a portrait of a dark-haired woman in a white suit against a white wall, and much, much more. This naked beauty crushed the heart, as an imperious palm crumples wet paper, because naked means defenseless. The beauty in front of Tony was defenseless. All the objects were neatly laid out, arranged, hung, and labeled, and it seemed to Tony that they were randomly huddled together, clinging to each other like hostages at gunpoint, so much despair and hopelessness in them. Tony had visited museum storerooms in his line of duty, where the next masterpieces were waiting for their turn, but even there he had never seen anything like it. They were studied there. There they could hope for the spacious halls of the museum. Here they were abandoned, like the children of alcoholics scared and unwanted. Previously, Tony would have attributed this feeling to his impressionability. Now he knew where it came from.
How can you do that to them?
He said almost pleadingly. He was a policeman. He saw blood and death. He saw a lot, and yet, right now, his soul was trembling like a tear on the tips of his eyelashes. Behind him, Grant exhaled sharply and heavily. Even the most violent swearing would not have conveyed even a tenth of the murderous anger that contained this exhalation. Tony didn't finish, couldn't bring himself to finish the question, but Grant understood him. "A lot," Grant replied grimly. "More than half." Tony knew how to comfort a rescued child. He'd done it before, but how can he comfort children he can't even see? Hungry, frightened children, of whom more than half are here. "Everything's going to be fine," Grant said softly, and Tony didn't know if he was reassuring the little Tsukumogami or Tony Applegate. "And," Grant added suddenly, with triumphant anger, "it's going to be fun. An aesthete hamster is coming here, in person." For someone as overweight as Kevin Alderboy, his gait was surprisingly light and noiseless. He didn't seem to come up, but immediately appeared in the doorway, short, stocky, almost square. His massive face was completely motionless, as if, unable to choose between fear, amazement, and anger, he felt nothing at all in the end. You, he finally uttered with an effort. "You, what? Where are you from? How did you get in here?" "Through the door, actually," Grant said politely. "I thought you'd at least ask who we are," Tony scolded him and added harshly, "Interpol. I'll ask you to come with us." "Interpol is not authorized to make arrests." Alderboy suddenly froze. "Who's talking about an arrest?" Grant was pleasantly surprised. "We're just doing you a favor. We offer you a ride to the nearest police station." "That's right," Tony confirmed. "And everything will be there for you. And there will be an arrest and a warrant, as it should be, and the rights will be read out." "Idiots." Alderboy scowled, his face darkening rapidly. "What do you think? I'm going to sit? With my lawyers? With my money? With my connections?" "Really?" Grant inquired kindly. "I suppose you will. And the full term, without appeals and amnesties. Otherwise, I will be very surprised. Very." Tony couldn't see Grant standing over his shoulder, but he could hear his voice. And I saw Kevin Alderboy's puffy face turn the color of soggy starch. "Yee." Tony didn't know what exactly Alderboy was facing from Grant's possible surprise, but Alderboy knew what he saw in the policeman's eyes, and he was more afraid of it than he was of jail time. "Fuck him," Tony chuckled, turning to Grant. "Not cool?" "No," Grant snapped. "Just right." Tony wouldn't call his gaze soft right now. In the depths of Tsukumogami's eyes, something that had no name in any human language was slowly turning over, fading away. "Tony," Grant said almost calmly, "imagine if your nephews were kidnapped, locked up, and starved to death by some idiot just because it was a good investment." "Well, that's why we're cops, to catch assholes like that," Tony replied reasonably. Grant nodded. "Well, aesthete hamster," he turned to Alderboy in a completely normal tone. "Let's go." At the station, Alderboy made such a show that it became part of the local legends. He tried to throw himself at the confused policeman's neck, howling and sobbing with relief. He confessed everything to everyone at once. Why, he was ready to arrest himself, and perhaps even hang himself, if only he would never surprise Grant Lestrade with anything. He calmed down only in the cell, having previously taken the most honest word from everyone present that they would go to the top right now to seize the stolen masterpieces. However, their removal was completed only well after midnight. Tony Applegate and Grant Lestrade rode in the last armored car that took Regina in White and Picasso's sketches from the top. "What are you sad about?" Grant called out to his partner. Indeed, there was nothing to be sad about. The case is solved, Alderboy is arrested, the stolen works of art are found, Tsukumogami are rescued. And yet Grant guessed right. "You know," Tony replied softly, not taking his eyes off the Regina, "I always knew you were alive. Always." It wasn't until he became an adult that Tony forgot his knowledge. And the children who will be born to him someday will have nothing to forget. They won't know, they'll just believe. It wasn't a fully realized thought, but rather a feeling. However, it was what filled Tony with an inarticulate sadness. He couldn't really say anything about that sadness, but Grant didn't need words. After all, he was once a plush inspector, a childhood friend. Grant remembered things about Tony that he didn't remember about himself, and understood things about him that he didn't understand about himself. Your family's children are very careful with toys. Grant smiled. It was a promise, clear and unambiguous.
Somewhere far away, in the as yet uncertain future, in which Tony was to become not just a cop, but a married cop, Tsukumogami was already waiting for his children, and they will definitely realize that their favorite toy is alive. They just can't help but understand.